Hello everyone, welcome to this short video on corporate social responsibility. I'm just going to go over the basics, even though the TED Talk and the Nestle newsletter should have gotten much of that work done, but I'll give you an overview of what it is in case there's any lingering questions, and talk a little bit about how to research for this for your life form paper as well. So first of all, what is corporate social responsibility? Well, as always, even though it wasn't assigned reading, you can just go to something like Wikipedia, and you're going to get plenty of info. You can see it's a big movement. And an important idea in the world. Governments alone can't fix everything. As the TED Talk discussed, we probably need to think of business, capitalism, business models as doing a lot of good work, not just making profit, but doing good in the world. And that's probably the first thing to think of when you think of corporate social responsibility. And I've got that jotted down right here. Business model not interested only in profit. It's concerned with human costs and environmental costs. Oftentimes, these are called externalities, and they can be negative or positive. Usually the way business is done, you might make $2 million off of the environment, but there might be $3 million worth of leftover land that you can do nothing with if you're doing strip mining or something. That $3 million isn't accounted for of potential loss, so whether it be aesthetic beauty, something that the public could use for other purposes that can no longer be used because of the strip mining or perhaps dangerous chemicals there. That isn't accounted for in traditional business models. And over the last few decades, and rightfully so, what people have started doing is saying, wait, we got to account for this too. And so many companies are trying to do this. Now, that would be in the area of environmental costs. There's also in CSR, human costs. That is, productive labor practices, fair labor practices, human rights, all of these type of things, making sure that if things are outsourced to a developing country, or an underdeveloped country, that people are being paid a fair wage. You can think of, if you drink coffee, you'll see fair trade coffee advertised. And so fair trade is part of CSR. It says, hey, these people in developed countries, we're not going to take advantage of them. We're going to make sure that they get a livable wage, right? So there's many, many different forms of this that you're probably familiar with, even if you don't think of them as being part of CSR, right? And so instead of government or law regulating, businesses adopt policies to affect the public good. Does everybody do this? No, not necessarily, but there is some growing pressure to do this, especially in certain businesses that use up a lot of resources. And sometimes, as you'll see in the Nestle newsletter, businesses that are worried about climate change, a topic for our course, affecting the agriculture that produces their business. You might have actually read in the news that we might not have chocolate in 50 years because of climate change, because there's not going to be enough arable land to grow all of the chocolate that is needed, all of the beans that are needed, right? And so Nestle has been on the forefront of combating this through retraining, through identifying new, more efficient farming techniques, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why we see that coming to fruition in this newsletter right here that we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So what does this do? Well, it changes the processes, the way that businesses make what they make, do what they do, the production practices. And it also changes the resources they might use, whether it's human resources or environmental resources. It might change the amount of money they wish to make. Some businesses make a little less money, but they have better practices, more sustainable practices. This is pretty noble, right? I think we can all agree. The business goal, not just to make profit, but to increase human welfare and human rights and achieve environmental justice. And not use up as many resources, not have as many negative externalities, right? So here's one problem that you can imagine, and it deals with a topic in our course. Sometimes CSR can just be rhetoric. Some businesses say that they're doing a better job or they're working toward a better business model, but will they ever get there, right? So it can be sort of a PR stunt at its worst. However, many businesses are doing good work, and they've got actually an oversight to make sure that they are doing this, right? So that can be one problem. The problem is a rhetorical problem. They say they're doing something, they're not really doing much, or they're doing some good practices, and they've still got plenty of negative practices, but they only promote through their rhetoric, through their PR, the good, positive, sustainable practices, right? However, there's pressure coming from everywhere. Companies pressure each other, especially in certain industries that need to become more sustainable. Consumers, this is something you can do. Consumers are becoming more interested in a company's social standing, a product's background. If you're interested at all in where your food comes from, whether it so that it's healthier for you, or so that it was made in a way that is sustainable, that treated, the laborers that made that, gave them a livable wage, right? Regardless of if it's in the U.S. or if it's outsourced to another country. You can do this type of thing. You can shop local so that there isn't as much transportation cost and as much transportation pollution. So there's a lot of local movement sign. You see those bumper stickers all over. Shop local, or who's your farmer, or those type of things, right? And so these are all things that consumers can do. So there's a lot of consumer pressure on company these days too, which is a form of activism, of course, which is a tie back to our course. All right, so if we want to look quickly at the newsletter, you'll see in here, I'm not going to say too much about it, but you'll see in here the main goals. So you can see one case. This is like a case study of CSR, right? And they're interested in socioeconomic production, so making sure that the laborers are treated fairly. But also what I find interesting is right here on the side, they've got farmers' income being increased. They improved the land, right? Wages went up, and they've got some environmental pillars too. Soil erosion was better managed. The water use went down by 20%, which is a fair amount. As I've mentioned before in the course, 70 to 80% of all the world's water is used by industry, not by people. Brushing your teeth, sanitation, whatever it might be. So these things are important, and only business can make sure that we have enough water for the future. Consumers alone cannot do it. All right, so you get a nice example of what CSR looks like. When you're researching, you want to figure out what are the companies that have the best practices that could do something to help your life form, right? And so that's where we're headed here. How do we research this? Well, you might just think about, where does your life form live? What poor business practices are going on that affect your habitat, your food chain, your reproduction, anything in any way. Urbanization could be included. That depends on your life form. What would better, more ideal business practices be? You could just imagine what they are, get rid of the bad, and then you can see if there's anybody doing that. That would be fantastic. That would be the positive model that we talked about in previous videos, the more of the rhetorical strategies. Remember, if you offer a positive model, people are more willing to produce the positive. It's that social proof theory, right? If you talk about all the negative practices, you would, to some degree, you would be encouraging businesses to continue in negative practices. If everybody else is doing it, why shouldn't they? So you want to model the best practices. You can point out what's wrong with practices, but you want to provide positive models as well. And there's good research showing that. We just didn't read that for this course. So that's what you want to do in your research, is try to find those. One example we can think of that you're familiar with from the course is the honeybee paper. Remember, it talked briefly about pesticides from agriculture affecting the bees and causing colony collapse disorder. We could just ask ourselves, what alternative pesticides exist that do not affect bees? You'd probably want to research that if you were a honeybee. Whatever life form you're doing, find the parallel here. But what alternatives exist? And that could be coming from the corporate world. It could be coming from the chemical world. CSR and sustainability take place everywhere, right? So just research these things, see what's going on. This is a community of people, and of course our class is writing in communities. So we're researching a new community here, the business community. More importantly, the sustainable, corporate, socially responsible business community, right? Of course, if we're thinking of rhetorical strategies, suggesting that CSR is good and that's evidence in your favor and you're doing all the positive role modeling, but you might be able to connect this back to human good. And remember, we want to argue that everything is immediate, local, and based in the human, will affect humans. So CSR might offer you some possibilities for that as well. If we think of the Nestle article, we can think of wages going up for farmers, of land use and water use being more efficient. That's good for the environment and maybe your life form, but it's good for people as well, clearly. So you can make an argument that, again, the human is improved through CSR practices that help you as well. So consider that as well. All these are rhetorical strategies. Repurpose your information in as many rhetorical frameworks as possible. That's always an option, right? The last thing I might say then, how to research all this. What I would simply do is go to Google and type in corporate social responsibility or sustainable business or sustainability or other keywords, plus your life form's name, and see what you get. I did that with the panda bear, just to see what would happen. You can see I had a bunch of different hits right here that I could look at. These would all be fine sources for your internet sources for the paper. And there's a long list of things. Some of them are not necessarily relevant to a project like this, but many are. I even did, just for fun, a weird one, and I did corporate responsibility and the moose. And guess what? Most of these, you can see it's like corporations that have moose in the title, but eventually down here at the bottom, I did find one that is actually corporate social responsibility, a Canadian company that was worried about affecting moose habitat, and they changed their practices. And so even if I was doing moose as my life form and practicing CSR, I've got one source, and that would be enough for this paper, right? So you can certainly find things. The last thing I might say, though, is that if you can't find anything, there's nothing for your life form on sustainability or CSR or really great business practices that would help your life form in particular, you can always just go to a very general source about corporate social responsibility. Maybe you can see this one just basically on animal rights or what CSR strategies are and how to build it. And I could just read those basic practices and then imagine how they could be interpreted or applied to my life form. So if you can't find anything specifically on your life form, that's fine. Sometimes you got to shoot the gap, so to speak, and say, this is what CSR is. I know that these are the problems from business that are hampering my life form, and CSR, in this case, would do these things to get rid of the bad business practices and move toward best sustainable business practices. And so you can build that on your own if there is no model out there for you. It's still good from a rhetorical framework because you are modeling positive behavior, even if it is imagined future behavior from a company. You're still modeling what could be done to help your life form. So in that way, it meets your CSR needs, but also your rhetorical needs of providing a positive model to the public, to your community, to this case, in this case, the business community. All right, so I hope that was helpful. Just a few thoughts on how to undertake this research and what CSR is. So thank you, everyone. You don't have to include a lot of CSR research in your life form paper, but it's probably worth looking into. Tuck this away for your personal life. It's a big deal. It's how the world will be changing in the future. Government can't do everything. And certainly it's a good area to research for your paper as well. Thank you.